Well, hello, church. This is Dennis Sanders. I'm the pastor of First Christian Church, Disciples of Christ in Roseville, Minnesota. Hope you all are doing well. So we are continuing our series in Lent, which is Unfinished, Discovering God's Call in the Not Yet. And today I want to look at John chapter 9, verses 1 through 41. And I'll also be looking at Joshua 7. This is talking about what is usually called the man born blind. But before I talk about the scripture, I want to talk a little bit about cars. Growing up as I do, I grew up in Michigan. Both my parents were retired, were auto workers. I'm a car guy. And I've been blessed that I have a husband that is also someone that is very much interested in cars. And so we look at cars, we love going to auto shows. We've gone to some of the big ones like Los Angeles and Detroit. And so we love kind of looking at cars and seeing what we want to get as our next car. And my husband at one time had a Smart 4.2. Now, for some of you who don't know, the Smart 4.2, it's not sold in the United States anymore, but when it was sold, it was the smallest car out there. And when I mean small, I mean tiny. It was very small. It has just 2 seats. Had a little bit of a space in the back that you could put some things in. And it was always kind of hilarious. We're both over 6 feet tall. We're rather big boys. So it was kind of funny to see these 2 tall men coming out of this very small car. It seemed more at home in streets in Europe than it did here in the United States. I can remember, though, that there was this one time, it could actually carry a few things. And there was this one time when Daniel's brother and his wife were expecting their first child. We had bought a changing table at IKEA. We were able to put the box, and it fit in the little back storage area, along with our clothing, because we were going to stay overnight. And we drove it all the way from the Twin Cities up to where his brother lives, between midway of Fargo and Grand Forks. It was always funny. My dad, I remember when he was alive, would see that car and we just would laugh. It just seemed like such a strange thing to see this little car and to see Big Daniel coming out of it. We have this thing in our culture about things that are small. And sometimes we don't always think that what's small is significant or matters. And that has me thinking about the text in John. It's a kind of weird text, and I remember the different translations that I've read in the past have always bothered me, because early on it says something about how Jesus says that this person is blind because we're going to see how God is going to work. And so I feel like, this guy was blind because God is going to do something. And that's not really the way probably to look at it. It was helpful to look at the Message translation that was done by the late Eugene Peterson. And his was a little bit different. It said something to the extent that this is an opportunity to see what God can do. To see what God can do. That God can do something when it seems like it's impossible, or when it seems like it's not enough. And that has me thinking about Gideon. Now, Gideon is one of my favorite stories. That's found in Judges chapter 7. He is a man that is afraid of his own shadow, but he's called to lead the Israelites. In fact, to lead them against the oppression of the Midianites. The Midianites were a neighboring kingdom, and they had come in and taken over the Israelites. And God calls this guy, who's a scaredy cat, to lead his people. In the preparation for a battle, 33,000 men show up. Now that should be good enough numbers for a good battle against the Midianites. But God tells them, no, that's too many people. And again and again and again, God keeps whittling it down until it's just 300 people. And then God tells them that their weapons were going to be trumpets and jars. Now, the Midianites had a huge army, a mighty army, and it didn't seem like there was any way that 300 men with nothing but some musical instruments and some pots and pans are going to beat this mighty army. And yet they did. We learn that God was with the Israelites, and God did hand them a victory. The trumpets and the smashing of the jars in the middle of the night scared the Midianites so much that they ended up fighting amongst themselves until that big army was decimated. Gideon's story of this puny little army that seemed like it couldn't do anything, led by a man that really wasn't any type of military leader, at least in our imagination, is a reminder that God can do great things. And I think about that man that was born blind in John 9. And he is made whole. But the Pharisees couldn't see this. The Pharisees were people that were trained in the law. They knew everything about God, except when they could see God working in the midst of them, in the lives of this man. We're going to see what God can do. Our church, First Christian Church of St. Paul, is a small congregation, and some would even say it's tiny. And we live in a culture that really prizes bigness. We prize success. And sometimes we're like the Pharisees in that we are blinded to seeing what God can do with the small, with the insignificant, with the outsider. It's easy to look and think that you have to have enough for God to work. But that's not really the case. God had enough because God is God. And this congregation, even though we are small, have done mighty things. I've been reminded over and over again through how God has worked and how we have raised money to help the poor, how we have been a congregation that is open and affirming, that has actually welcomed people who didn't think such a place existed. In God, we are enough. God works through us so that others can see what God can do. At the end of the day, we're enough. Not because of ourselves, but because of what God has done. What God did through Gideon, what God did through Jesus to heal the blind man. God is enough. God can do mighty things, even when we aren't so sure. I believe that God can and does use this congregation to be a witness in Roseville, in the Twin Cities, in the United States, and to the ends of the earth. I pray that we can have faith to see what God can do, what God can do with the least, with the little, with the left out, because God can do great things. Small does not mean insignificant. If God can do what God did through Gideon, think of what God can do through us. Take care, church. Godspeed, and I'll see you soon.